The bride was left at the altar, but the groom's millionaire brother went to comfort her. The hall of St. Patrick's Church in Manhattan was filled with white flowers and more than 200 eager guests. Willow Morgan watched her reflection in the ornate mirror in the bridal room, her hands trembling as she adjusted for the last time the French lace veil her grandmother had worn at her own wedding. The Vera Wang dress was perfect, just as everything that day should be. 15 minutes, announced her best friend Madison, peeking through the door with a nervous smile. Then her cell phone vibrated. A text message from Bradley Richardson, her fiancé. "I can't do this. Forgive me." The world seemed to slow down to a complete stop. Willow felt the air leave her lungs as she reread the message, unable to process the words that danced before her eyes. Her legs weakened, and she had to lean on the antique dressing table. "Willow," the deep, familiar voice made her turn around. Nash Richardson was standing in the doorway, imposing in his best man's tuxedo. His blue eyes, so different from Bradley's brown ones, met hers through the mirror. "I just got a call from Brad. He's not coming," Willow added, her voice surprisingly steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "His brother just dumped me by text message on my wedding day." Nash crossed the room in 3 strides, his jaw tense in a way that Willow already knew well after 5 years of family life. At 32, he was 4 years older than Bradley and always seemed to be the most responsible of the Richardson brothers. "I'll sort it out," he declared, reaching for his cell phone. "No," Willow stopped him, touching his arm. "There's nothing to sort out." The buzz outside was beginning to grow. Soon everyone would know. The successful editor-in-chief of Morgan Publishing left at the altar. Her father, Richard Morgan, would be devastated, not by the social humiliation, but by seeing his only daughter suffer. "I need to get out of here," she muttered, more to herself than to Nash. "My house in Hampton is empty," Nash offered without hesitation. "I can take you there right now. You decide later what you want to do." Willow looked at him, surprised by the offer and the practicality of the solution. Nash had always been like that, present at crucial moments, offering help without making a fuss. While Bradley was the charismatic Richardson who lit up parties, Nash was the family's silent anchor. "But what about the guests? The party? Everything's already paid for, and Madison could take care of that," Nash interrupted her gently. "You don't have to face 200 people right now." As if summoned, Madison entered the room, tears already in her eyes. "Bradley's father has just arrived alone. People are starting to speculate." "Maddie," Willow took a deep breath. "I need you to be the strongest person in the world right now. Can you do that for me?" Over the next 10 minutes, a plan was hatched. Madison would announce the cancellation of the wedding and coordinate the situation with the suppliers. Nash would drive Willow through the back of the church to her black Range Rover, and they would head for Hampton before the storm of gossip and speculation began. As they snuck down the side aisle of the church, Willow still in her wedding dress and Nash carrying a small emergency suitcase that Madison had prepared, reality began to set in. She would no longer be Mrs. Richardson, at least not Mrs. Bradley Richardson. "You're very quiet," Nash commented when they were already on the highway, leaving Manhattan behind. "I'm trying to figure out when it all went wrong," she confessed, looking out of the window. "How'd I not see this coming?" Nash adjusted his hands on the steering wheel, a gesture that Willow had already noticed was a nervous tick of his. Sometimes people aren't who you think they are, or maybe they are exactly who they are, and we're the ones who refuse to see it. The June afternoon sun was beginning to lower when they arrived at Nash's house in Hampton. The waterfront property was a sleek, modern retreat, very different from the Richardsons' ostentatious Manhattan mansion. It was a perfect reflection of its owner, sophisticated without being pretentious. "You can stay as long as you like," Nash said, carrying the suitcase inside. "There's food in the fridge, Wi-Fi, and total privacy." "You're not staying?" Willow asked, surprising herself with the almost disappointed tone in her voice. Nash stopped in the middle of the living room, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "Only if you want me to. I can stay in the guest room." Willow nodded, grateful for the company. The idea of being alone with her thoughts at that moment seemed too frightening. "Thank you, Nash, for everything." "No need to fake me," he replied softly. "That's what family does." "Family?" The word echoed in Willow's mind as she climbed the stairs to change. A few hours ago, she was about to officially become part of the Richardson family. Now, ironically, the only Richardson by her side was the one who had always been there, silently present at every important moment over the last 5 years. What Willow didn't know was that that day, which should have been the end of one story, was about to become the beginning of a very different one. And maybe, just maybe, fate knew exactly what it was doing when it put Nash Richardson in her path that June afternoon. Willow woke up disoriented in the master suite of Hampton's house, the last rays of the setting sun streaming in through the panoramic windows. For a moment, her brain struggled to process where she was and why she was still wearing the silk nightgown she was supposed to wear on her first night of marriage. Reality hit her like a cold wave. She went downstairs barefoot, following the scent of fresh coffee coming from the kitchen. Nash had his back to her, preparing something on the stove, the sleeves of his white shirt folded up to his elbows. The familiarity of the scene caught her off guard. How many times had she seen him cooking during the Richardsons' family dinners? "I thought you might be hungry," he said without turning around, as if sensing her presence. "You haven't eaten anything since yesterday." "How do you always know?" she asked, taking a seat on the high stool of the kitchen island. Nash finally turned around, placing a plate of eggs Benedict in front of her. "You have this habit of not eating when you're anxious. I noticed it on the day of your first important presentation at the publishing house." The comment surprised her. It was true. She was terrified of public speaking and had barely managed to touch her breakfast before presenting her new publishing project to the board. But that had been 3 years ago. The fact that Nash had noticed and remembered made something stir in his chest. "Madison called," he continued, pouring them both coffee. "The press are already speculating. Apparently, Brad was seen boarding a flight to Cancun with his assistant Lauren. Lauren, the blonde, efficient assistant Bradley had hired 6 months ago. Willow felt her stomach churn, the pieces falling into place with painful clarity. "Did you know?" she asked, her voice calmer than she had expected. Nash rested his hands on the marble counter, his blue eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "I suspected. I tried to talk to him a few times, but Brad, he was always good at making people see what he wanted them to see. Including me." Willow laughed humorlessly, stirring her coffee. "God, how could I have been so blind? The strange hours at the office, the business trips that came out of nowhere." "Don't blame yourself," Nash interrupted firmly. "Brad has always been an expert at manipulation. Ever since we were kids, he managed to convince our parents that his antics were mine." Something in the way Nash spoke made Willow look at him more closely. There was a story there, buried under years of family diplomacy. "Why didn't you ever get married, Nash?" she asked suddenly, surprising them both with a direct question. He seemed to consider the answer for a moment, rotating his coffee cup between his hands. "Let's just say that the right person was unavailable." The silence that followed was charged with something Willow couldn't quite name. For the first time, she really looked at Nash, not as Bradley's brother, but as a man in his own right. The same genes that had given Bradley his superficial charm had endowed Nash with a deeper, more mature beauty. "Let's go for a walk," he suggested abruptly, breaking the moment. "The sunset on the beach is spectacular, and you need some fresh air." Minutes later, they were walking barefoot on the still warm sand. The Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly in front of them, painted in shades of orange and pink by the setting sun. "You know what's ironic?" Willow began, lightly kicking the water. "I'm more hurt by the way it happened than by the end itself." "A text message, Nash? After 5 years?" "Brad was never good at facing the consequences of his actions," Nash replied, his words carrying the weight of decades of observation. "He always preferred the easy way out." "What about you?" she asked, stopping to stare at him. "You always seem to choose the hard way. Being here with me, for example, when you could be in Manhattan saving the family's reputation." Nash took a step towards her, so close that she could see the shades of blue in his eyes. "Some things are more important than reputation, Willow." The sea wind ruffled his dark hair, and Willow felt a sudden urge to tousle it. Instead, she hugged herself, feeling the chill of the night approaching. "Let's go back," Nash suggested, noticing her shivery. I can make you that hot chocolate you like so much. With extra marshmallows? She asked, a small smile appearing on her lips for the first time since the day before. Always with extra marshmallows for you, he replied with a smile that lit up his eyes. As they walked back to the house, Willow realized that, for the first time since receiving that fateful message, she wasn't thinking about Bradley. Instead, her mind was busy trying to understand how she had never noticed the way Nash looked at her, as if she were the only person on the beach in the world. Fate, she was beginning to suspect, had a peculiar sense of humor. And maybe, just maybe, it also had perfect timing. The next morning, Willow found a note from Nash on the refrigerator door. I had to take care of some things in Manhattan. I'll be back soon. There are fresh croissants in the oven. His handwriting, firm and elegant, contrasted with the casual message of abandonment that Bradley had sent 2 days before. While he was enjoying breakfast on the balcony overlooking the ocean, his phone rang. It was Madison. The gossip magazines are having a field day, her friend sighed. Bradley and Lauren were photographed in Cancun. Apparently, they've been in a relationship for months. Willow closed her eyes, letting the sea breeze caress her face. You know what's weird, Maddie? I don't feel that tearing pain that I should feel. It's more like relief. Maybe because, deep down, you knew something was wrong, Madison suggested. By the way, what's it like staying at Nash's? There was something in Madison's tone that made Willow straighten up in a chair. What do you mean? Oh, please, Madison laughed softly. Haven't you ever noticed how he looks at you? How he always appeared coincidentally at the events you were at? How he memorized your favorite coffee and always had one available at the publishers' meetings? Willow's heart raced as memories of the last 5 years flashed through her mind like a high-speed movie. Nash always present in emergencies, always attentive to details that even Bradley didn't notice. Maddie, he's mine. He was my brother-in-law, Willow protested weakly. And now he's not, Madison replied simply. Look, I need to go. Just keep an open mind, okay? After hanging up, Willow walked into the house's library, a cozy room with floor-to-ceiling shelves. Her eyes caught something familiar, a first edition of The Great Gatsby, her favorite book. Nash had mentioned it in a conversation years ago, when she commented on her passion for Fitzgerald. An envelope fell out when she picked up the book. Inside was an old photo, Nash younger, smiling next to her at a publisher's event. It was her first week as editor-in-chief, before she had even met Bradley. In the photo, Nash's eyes were fixed on her, with an expression she now recognized. I thought you'd find this eventually. Nash's voice sounded behind her, making her turn around quickly. Nash, we need to talk, he said softly, stepping closer. There's something you should know, something I've kept for a long time. Willow felt her heart hammer against her chest as Nash guided her to sit on the leather sofa in the library. He seemed nervous, something rare for someone always so controlled. I met you first, he began, his voice low and intense. At that publisher's event. I spent the whole evening plucking up the courage to ask you to dinner, but Bradley beat me to it. He was always quicker, bolder. Why didn't you ever say anything? Willow asked, her voice trembling slightly. Because you seemed happy, Nash replied simply. And your happiness was always more important than my feelings. The silence that followed was heavy with 5 years of unspoken words. Willow looked down at the photo in her hands. Seen now would have been in front of her all along. When Bradley sent me that message, she began slowly. My first thought was to call you. Not for him, not for Madison. You. Nash moved a little closer, his intense blue eyes fixed on hers. I've always been here, Willow, even when it hurt to see you with him. Even when your every smile at Bradley was like a stab. I was here. All this time, she murmured, reaching hesitantly for his face. The ringing of Nash's phone broke the moment. It was the Richardson family lawyer, needing to discuss the situation with Bradley. I need to sort this out, he said, getting up reluctantly. But this conversation isn't over. No, it's not over, Willow agreed, feeling something new bloom in her chest, something that had perhaps always been there, waiting for the right moment to awaken. When Nash left the library, Willow remained seated, the photo still in her hands. Sometimes, she thought, fate turns us all around to bring us exactly where we should have been from the start. The sea breeze came in through the open window, bringing with it the scent of possibilities. And for the first time since her failed marriage, Willow smiled. Not a smile of consolation or resignation, but a smile of discovery. Nash's revelation had left Willow in a state of emotional confusion that she had never experienced before. Sitting on the balcony of the Hamptons' house, she watched the waves break on the beach while trying to organize her thoughts. Her phone vibrated with another message from Madison. "The papers are speculating that you ran off with Nash," the message said. "Photos of you leaving church together are circulating." Willow sighed deeply. Of course, the press would turn her most vulnerable moment into a sensationalist story. Morgan Publishing was one of the largest publishing houses in the country, and her personal life always attracted unwanted attention. "I need to get back to Manhattan," she decided aloud, just as Nash was returning from his meeting with the lawyers. "Are you sure?" he asked, approaching with that characteristic calm that now seemed to affect Willow in a completely different way. "Here you're protected from the media circus." "I can't hide forever," she replied, standing up. "The publisher needs me, and the longer I stay here, the more people speculate about us." The last word came out almost as a whisper, loaded with unexplored possibilities. Nash took a step towards her, his intense blue eyes fixed on hers. "And that would be so bad?" he asked softly. Before Willow could answer, her phone rang. It was her father, Richard Morgan. "Darling," his voice sounded worried, "I've just arrived from London. Why don't you come to dinner with me tonight? Chef Pierre has prepared that lobster risotto you love." The Morgan mansion on the Upper East Side had always been his safe haven. "Of course, Dad. I'll be there at 7. After hanging up, she turned to Nash. "Do you want to come with me?" The question took him by surprise. "Won't your father find it strange?" "My father always liked you better than Bradley," she admitted with a small smile. "Besides, he deserves to know the truth about everything." The drive from Hampton to Manhattan was filled with a different kind of tension from 2 days ago. Every glance exchanged, every restrained smile, carried the weight of recent revelations. Arriving at the Morgan mansion, they were met by the Thompson butler, who had served in the family for 3 decades. Richard Morgan was waiting for them in his study, an imposing room decorated with rare first editions and family photographs. "Nash," Richard greeted with genuine satisfaction. "How nice of you to come. I imagine you were a real gentleman during those difficult days." During dinner, Willow observed how naturally her father and Nash interacted, discussing literature and business. It was so different from the superficial conversations Bradley used to have, always more interested in talking about his own achievements. "Daughter," Richard began after dessert, "I've seen the speculation in the press. I want you to know that, whatever happens, your well-being is my only concern." Willow felt tears forming in her eyes. "Dad, there's something I need to tell you. About Bradley, about Nash, about everything." Over the next 2 hours, the whole story came out. Bradley's betrayal, Nash's guarded feelings, the last days in Hampton. Richard listened to it all in silence, occasionally casting sympathetic glances at Nash. "You know," Richard finally said, "I've always wondered why you chose Bradley when Nash was clearly more compatible with you. But sometimes you have to take the long way round to get to the right destination." "Mr. Morgan," Nash intervened, his voice firm but respectful, "I want you to know that my feelings for Willow are genuine. It's not a reaction to what Bradley did. It's something that's always been there." Richard stood up, walking over to the window, overlooking the bright garden. "Nash, you saved my daughter from even greater public humiliation. More than that, you were always there, silently protecting her. As a father, I couldn't ask for more." Willow felt her heart race at her father's words. It was as if the whole universe was conspiring to show her what had been in front of her all these years. When they left the Morgan mansion, the Manhattan night shone with thousands of lights. Nash stopped the car in front of Willow's building on the Upper West Side. "I don't have to go back to the Hamptons today," he said softly. "I can stay in my apartment here." Willow hesitated for a moment before replying. "Well, you could come up for coffee. We have a lot to talk about." The elevator rose silently to the 12th floor. As they entered the apartment, Willow realized that it was the first time she had been alone with Nash in his own space. Somehow, that made it all the more real. "You know," she began as she prepared the coffee, "Madison told me something interesting today. about how you've always been there in the small details. Nash approached the kitchen worktop, his eyes never leaving hers. Some feelings are impossible to hide completely, no matter how hard you try. The aroma of coffee filled the room, but neither of them made any mention of serving themselves. They were stuck in a moment of realization, as if 5 years of repressed emotions had finally found their way to the surface. "What do we do now?" Willow asked, her voice just a whisper. "Now," Nash replied, narrowing the distance between them. "We do what we should have done since that first day at the publishing house." In the kitchen of their Manhattan apartment, Willow finally understood that sometimes the truest love is the one that waits patiently to be discovered. The next morning brought with it not only the golden light of the Manhattan sun, but also the reality of the headlines in the city's main tabloids. "Morgan Publishing heiress finds comfort in brother-in-law's arms" was just one of the many sensationalist variations circulating. Willow watched the news on her tablet while drinking coffee in her apartment, Nash asleep on the sofa in the living room where he had insisted on spending the night, politely refusing the guest room. The previous night's conversation had stretched into the early hours of the morning, full of revelations and memories shared from a new perspective. Her phone vibrated with a message from Bradley. The first since the fateful wedding text. "I saw the photos." "You and Nash? Really?" "I barely waited to leave the scene." Anger bubbled up in his chest. How dare he imply something like that after what he had done? Before she could reply, Nash appeared in the kitchen, his hair slightly disheveled and his dress shirt from the day before crumpled. "Don't answer," he said softly, noticing the expression on her face. "That's exactly what he wants, to create drama, to play the victim." "How do you always know what I'm thinking?" she asked, putting the phone away. 5 years of watching your every expression, memorizing your every reaction," he replied with an honesty that made her heart race. "I think I've developed a PhD in Willow Morgan." The moment was interrupted by the doorbell. It was Claire Stevens, the vice president of Morgan Publishing. "Willow, darling." Claire entered like a hurricane of Chanel and determination. "The board is buzzing. We need you at the emergency meeting in an hour to—" "Oh, Nash." Claire's gaze alternated between the two of them, her perfectly shaped eyebrows arching in understanding. "Well, that explains the rumors. And honestly, it's a considerable upgrade." "Claire," Willow protested, feeling her face burn. "What?" "Just stating the obvious." Claire shrugged, taking an elegant seat on the kitchen bench. "Now, about the meeting, we need to work out how to deal with the press. Morgan Publishing is about to launch that series of contemporary novels, and the whole thing could be excellent publicity if handled well. I'm not going to turn my personal life into a marketing strategy," Willow declared firmly. "Actually," Nash interjected, his voice calm but determined, "perhaps we should consider an official statement. Something simple, straightforward, that clarifies the facts before speculation gets out of hand." Claire smiled approvingly. "I always knew you were more than just good-looking, Nash. Richardson Investments is lucky to have you as CEO." After Claire left with the promise of a joint statement from the two companies, Willow found herself alone with Nash again. "We need to talk about last night," she began, biting her lip nervously. "About the almost kiss, or about everything that came before?" Nash asked, a slight smile playing on his lips. "About us," she replied. "About timing and expectations, and the fact that until 3 days ago, I was about to marry your brother." Nash moved closer, leaning on the kitchen worktop. "Willow, I've spent 5 years respecting your relationship with Bradley, keeping my feelings in check. I'm not asking us to skip steps or ignore the past. I'm just asking for a chance to do things the right way this time." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep inside her. It was so different from the way Bradley communicated, always with half-truths and empty promises. "The board meeting is in 40 minutes, she finally said. "But afterwards, maybe we can have dinner? Just the two of us. No pressure, no expectations." Nash's smile lit up his face in a way that made Willow's heart skip a beat. "I know a little Italian restaurant in the West Village. Nothing too formal, just good food and honest conversation." As she prepared for the meeting, Willow reflected on how drastically her life had changed in just a few days. The cancelled wedding, which should have been the end of her romantic hopes, was proving to be just the prologue to a much truer story. In the Morgan Publishing boardroom, while presenting the strategy for dealing with the situation, Willow realized that for the first time in a long time, she was completely present in the moment. There was no anxiety about a future with Bradley, just a quiet certainty that, whatever happened with Nash, it would be something built on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. And maybe, she thought as she finished the meeting, this was the real start she had always deserved. The Italian restaurant Nash had chosen was exactly as he had described it, cozy and discreet, tucked away on a quiet street in the West Village. Willow arrived a few minutes early, still wearing her executive suite from the board meeting, her heart beating at an irregular pace that had nothing to do with the subway ride there. Miss Morgan, the maitre d' greeted her familiarly. "Mr. Richardson has already reserved our most private table. This way, please." As she followed the man through the candlelit room, Willow realized that Nash must frequent the place regularly. It was exactly his style, elegant without being pretentious, traditional without being old-fashioned. "Sorry I'm late." Nash emerged a few minutes later, still in his business suit. The board of Richardson Investments also wanted an emergency meeting. "I imagine your agenda was similar to mine," she commented, watching him settle in. "How did things go?" "Let's just say that my father wasn't exactly pleased to discover that his eldest son is in love with his youngest ex-fiancée," he replied with a half-smile, making Willow's heart leap at the word "in love." A waitress brought over a bottle of red wine that Nash had apparently ordered in advance, a Brunello that Willow had mentioned loving during a family dinner years ago. "You really paid attention to everything, didn't you?" she asked softly, watching him pour the wine. "Every detail," he confirmed, his blue eyes meeting hers over his glass. "Every preference, every story, every smile, even when it hurt to watch from afar." Dinner progressed with an intimacy that surprised Willow. It was different from all the encounters she'd had with Bradley. There was no need to fill silences with forced conversation or maintain a perfect social facade. "Madison called me today," she commented as they savored the fungi risotto. Apparently, Bradley and Lauren were seen shopping in jewelry stores in Cancun. Nash put down his fork, studying her reaction. "How do you feel about that?" "Honestly, relieved," she admitted. "It's as if the universe had stopped me from making an even bigger mistake, marrying someone who never really knew me." "What now?" Nash asked, his voice low and intense. "What do you want, Willow?" The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities. Before she could answer, her phone vibrated with a message. It was a photo sent by an unknown number. Bradley and Lauren in an intimate moment on a beach, clearly taken months before their failed marriage. "Someone's trying to provoke me," she muttered, showing the photo to Nash. "We're teasing us," he corrected, his jaw tense. Lauren has always been territorial, even when she had no right to anything or anyone. The implication in his words made Willow raise her eyes quickly. "You in her?" "No," Nash replied firmly, but she tried several times before turning her attention to Bradley. "I think she always knew about my feelings for you." Willow's cell phone vibrated again. This time it was a text message from Lauren herself. "I hope you're happy now that you have the 2 Richardson brothers in your collection." "This ends now," Willow declared, quickly typing a reply. "Lauren, your attempts at manipulation are as transparent as your lack of character. Enjoy Cancun." And Bradley, "You really deserve each other." Nash watched with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You don't have to deal with this alone." "I'm not alone," she replied, reaching for his hand on the table. "For the first time in a long time, I'm really not." The touch between them sent an electric current through both their bodies. It was unlike anything Willow had ever experienced, as if every cell of her being recognized something fundamental in Nash. "There's a place I want to show you," he said suddenly, paying the bill despite her protests. "Trust me." 20 minutes later, they were at the top of the Richardson Investments building, one of Manhattan's most imposing skyscrapers. The Hanging Garden was a secret oasis overlooking the entire city. "I come here to think," Nash explained, guiding her through beds of lavender and jasmine. "Over the last few years, especially when things with you and Bradley got hard to watch." Willow stopped in front of him, the city's shining around her like a sea of stars. "Why did you bring me here?" "Because I want to start with no secrets," he replied, his voice trembling slightly. "This place holds every moment I wanted to tell you the truth. Every time I had to remind myself that your happiness came first." "And now?" she asked, echoing his question from the restaurant. "Now," Nash replied, narrowing the distance between them, "I want to create new memories here. Memories where I no longer have to hide what I feel." The Manhattan night wind blew gently around them, carrying the scent of flowers and the promise of something new, something true. And there, under the starry New York sky, Willow finally understood that sometimes you have to lose what you thought you wanted in order to find what you've always needed. The front page of the Wall Street Journal that morning featured a photo of Nash and Willow in the hanging garden of Richardson Investments. The headline suggested a premeditated romance between the CEO and his brother's ex-fiancée. The timing of the photo was too suspicious to be a coincidence. "Someone followed us last night," Nash declared, entering Willow's office at Morgan Publishing with the newspaper in hand. His normally serene face was tense with worry. "Lauren," Willow replied without hesitation, turning her monitor to show an email received minutes earlier. "She just sent me this." The email contained a series of old photos. Nash observing Willow at various social events over the years, always with that look she now recognized so well. The message read, "5 years of obsession documented. The press would love to know how the respected CEO of Richardson Investments spent years lusting after his brother's fiancée. She's trying to destroy his reputation," Willow realized, noticing how Nash paled slightly at the sight of the photos. "No," he corrected, running a hand through his hair in a rare gesture of nervousness. "She's trying to break us up before we even have a chance to start." Claire entered the office without knocking, her Louboutin heels echoing on the marble floor. "I've just left the conference with the press office. We need a strategy, and we need it now." "I'm not going to hide," Willow declared, standing up. "Nor am I going to allow Lauren to turn something pure into something sordid." Nash watched her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Willow, my reputation can survive this. Richardson Investments has solid foundations. But Morgan Publishing has survived 2 world wars, 3 stock market crashes, and countless scandals," Claire interrupted. "And Willow is right. Transparency is our best defense." Nash's phone rang. It was his father, Alexander Richardson. The look on his face as he answered said it all. The storm had only just begun. "Emergency board meeting in 1 hour," he announced after hanging up. "Apparently, some shareholders are questioning my ability to lead due to conflict of interest." Willow felt her heart squeeze. In less than a week, her personal life had turned into a corporate minefield that threatened not only her reputation, but also the legacy of 2 of New York's most important companies. "Go," she said softly. "Face the board. I'll deal with Lauren." "Not alone," Claire declared. "I have some contacts in the press who would love to know about certain incidents involving Lauren during her time as an intern at Vogue." Nash hesitated in the doorway, his eyes meeting Willow's with an intensity that made Claire discreetly leave the room. "Dinner at my penthouse tonight? We need to talk about everything." "At 8, Willow agreed, resisting the urge to cross the room and kiss him. It wasn't the time yet, not with so many shadows of the past hanging over them. After Nash left, Willow plunged into an afternoon of strategy meetings and crisis management. Madison showed up after lunch, bringing coffee and moral support. Bradley called. Her friend informed her, taking a seat on the office sofa. He said that Lauren is out of control, that he had no idea of her plans to expose you and Nash. "And you believe him?" Willow asked, arching an eyebrow. "Honestly, I think Bradley is realizing that he's lost more than he thought," Madison replied. "The way Nash looks at you, it's the kind of love Bradley was never able to offer." At 8 o'clock sharp, Willow arrived at Nash's penthouse on the Upper East Side. The apartment was a perfect reflection of his personality, elegant and sophisticated, yet cozy. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan sparkled like a sea of diamonds. "How did it go with the council?" she asked, accepting the glass of wine he offered. "I've managed to get around it for now," Nash replied, guiding her to the balcony. "But we need to be careful, Willow. Not for me or Richardson Investments, but for you. Morgan Publishing is your legacy. My legacy is more than a company, she said softly. It's about integrity, about being true to who I am. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm being completely honest with myself. Nash placed his glass on the coffee table, approaching her with that intensity that made her heart soar. We need to decide if this us is worth the risk. You've waited 5 years, Willow replied, meeting his gaze. Do you really think a few sensationalist headlines and empty threats are going to scare me off now? The smile that lit up Nash's face was like the sunrise after a long night. I always knew you were the bravest of us all. There, under the starry Manhattan sky, with the weight of 2 corporate dynasties on their shoulders, Willow and Nash began to realize that some love stories are bigger than any scandal. And that maybe, just maybe, the real legacy lies not in the empires we build, but in the truths we choose to defend. The morning after the night at Nash's penthouse brought with it an unexpected storm in Manhattan. Willow was watching the raindrops drip down her office window when Madison burst through the door, her normally cheerful face marked by concern. Bradley's here, she announced without preamble. In the lobby, he's back from Cancun, and he's demanding to speak to you. Willow's heart raced, not from anxiety or longing, but from deep irritation. After everything that had happened, after the photos leaked by Lauren, what was the point of this visit? Send him up, Willow decided, adjusting her posture in the chair. It's time to close this chapter for good. Bradley entered the office as he always did, as if he owned the place. But something was different. His Cancun tan couldn't mask the tiredness in his eyes, and his usual confident smile seemed forced. Well, he began, using the nickname she had always hated. We need to talk about this whole situation with Nash. There's no situation to discuss, she replied coldly. You chose Lauren, remember? A text message on our wedding day was quite clear about your priorities. Lauren is out of control. Bradley ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that now made her think of Nash. The photos, the threats, that's not what I wanted. And what exactly did you want, Bradley? Because the way I see it, you perfectly orchestrated your escape with your lover, leaving your brother to clean up your mess. The mention of Nash made Bradley's expression harden. So it's true? You and my brother? You barely waited for the altar to cool down. Don't you dare. Willow stood up, her voice shaking with restrained anger. Don't you dare insinuate anything about Nash. He has more integrity in his pinky than you have in your whole body. He's always wanted what was mine, Bradley retorted bitterly. Ever since we were kids, the attention of our parents, the presidency of the company, and now you. I was never his property, Willow replied, her voice as sharp as ice. And maybe that's exactly your problem, Bradley. You see people as possessions, achievements. Nash sees people as people. The phone on the table rang. It was Claire, informing him that the press were gathering in the lobby. Apparently, someone had leaked the information about Bradley's visit. Lauren, Bradley muttered, checking his own cell phone. She must have followed me. Of course she did, Willow sighed, because that's exactly what toxic people do. They feed off the chaos they create. At that moment, Nash entered the office, his eyes immediately assessing the situation. The contrast between the brothers had never been more evident. Bradley, with his defensive posture and accusing gaze, and Nash, emanating a protective calm that made Willow relax instantly. The Richardson board is meeting, Nash announced, keeping a respectful distance. We need a joint statement to end this soap opera once and for all. Joint? Bradley laughed humorlessly. You want me to take part in your little romantic theater? I want you to be man enough to make your own choices, Nash replied, his voice firm but controlled. Lauren is destroying reputations, threatening business legacies, and for what? To protect a case that you yourself chose to make public in the worst possible way. The silence that followed was deafening. Willow watched the brothers, realizing for the first time how their differences went far beyond physical appearance. Enough, she decided, picking up her phone. Madison, call the press office. Claire, get Morgan's board together. In an hour, we'll hold a press conference. All of us? All of us? Bradley questioned. Yes, all of us, Willow confirmed. You mean Nash? And since Lauren insists on taking part in this story, she's invited too? Let's put all the cards on the table. Nash watched her with a mixture of pride and concern. Are you sure? Absolutely, she replied, meeting his gaze. Some stories need to be told from the right perspective. An hour later, the Morgan Publishing auditorium was packed with journalists. Willow, Nash, and Bradley occupied the stage, with Lauren arriving at the last minute, clearly not expecting to be included in the event. Ladies and gentlemen, Willow began, her voice firm on the microphone. We're here to clear up a number of speculations that have been circulating in the media. What followed was an exercise in brutal honesty. Bradley, pressured by the situation, admitted his relationship with Lauren. Lauren, taken aback by the public exposure, was forced to acknowledge her smear campaign. As for Nash and me, Willow continued, feeling the strength of his presence at her side. Our story is just beginning, and it will begin the right way, with truth and respect. By the time the press conference was over, the storm outside had subsided, as if the sky itself recognized that it was time for a new beginning. In the private elevator going up to her office, Willow finally allowed her legs to shake. You were amazing, Nash murmured, holding her hand. We were, she corrected, entwining her fingers with his. That's how it's going to be from now on, weathering the storms together. Nash's smile lit up his eyes in a way that made Willow's heart leap. Some stories, she realized, need a few difficult chapters to reach their true beginning. News of the press conference at Morgan Publishing dominated the financial news the following morning. The New York Times highlighted the unusual transparency with which the Morgan and Richardson families handled the situation, while Financial Weekly speculated on the implications for both companies. Willow was in her office reviewing the headlines when Richard Morgan walked in, carrying an old leather briefcase. I found this while organizing some files, he said, placing the folder on the desk. They're photos from Morgan Publishing's charity event 5 years ago, the first one Nash attended. Curious, Willow opened the folder. The first photo showed her and Nash chatting near an ornate fountain, both smiling in a way that now seemed so obvious. It was that same evening that Bradley had appeared, stealing all her attention with his characteristic charm. Have you always known? She asked her father, who was looking at the photo with a knowing smile. Let's just say that a father notices certain things, Richard replied, taking a seat. The way Nash always showed up at the meetings you conducted, how he made sure you had fresh coffee during the long negotiations. The intercom interrupted the conversation. It was Margaret Richardson, Nash and Bradley's mother, requesting an immediate meeting. Willow felt her stomach turn. Although Margaret had always been cordial, her loyalty to the Richardson family image was legendary. Send her up, Willow decided, exchanging a meaningful glance with her father. Margaret entered the office like a gust of Chanel No. 5 in aristocratic determination. At 60, she maintained the same elegant posture that had made her one of the leading figures in New York society. Richard, she greeted with a brief nod before turning to Willow. We need to talk about the future of our families. Margaret, Richard began, his voice carrying a protective tone, but he was interrupted by a gesture from the Richardson matriarch. Please let me finish, she requested, sitting down with studied grace. I've spent the whole evening going through old family albums. Do you know what I discovered, Willow? In every photo from the last 5 years, whenever you appeared, Nash was there. Not in an obvious way, but present, watching, protecting. Willow felt her throat tighten at the emotion in Margaret's voice. Bradley was always my impulsive son, the one who acted first and thought later, Margaret continued. Nash is like his father, calm, calculating, loyal to the marrow, and I fail to see how much he suffered, watching you with your brother. Mrs. Richardson, Willow began, but Margaret raised her hand again. Please call me Margaret. After all, you'll still be my daughter-in-law, just with the right son this time. Richard let out a soft laugh, breaking the tension in the room. I always knew you were more perceptive than you let on, Margaret. Oh, Richard, she smiled. We parents always know more than our children realize. The question now is, how do we protect our own? Over the next hour, an unlikely alliance was formed. The two most powerful families in Manhattan joined forces not only to protect their business empires, but above all to defend the love that had grown silently between Nash and Willow. When Nash arrived later that day, he found his mother and the Morgans laughing about old family stories. "Did something happen that I should know about?" he asked, his gaze meeting Willow's with that intensity she now recognized so well. "Just our families realizing that some unions are written in the stars," Marva replied, getting up to hug her son. "Even if it takes 5 years for everyone to realize it." That evening, after everyone had left, Willow and Nash walked through Central Park, the place where they had met by chance so many times in recent years. "Your mom showed me something interesting today," Willow commented, stopping near the Bethesda fountain. "A photo from the day we met. The charity event." Nash smiled, his eyes lost in memory. "You were wearing a blue dress and talking passionately about a new children's literature project." "Do you remember what I was wearing?" she asked in surprise. "Willow," he turned to face her. "I remember every detail of every moment we spent together. Even when I couldn't show it, even when I had to pretend they were just casual family encounters." The confession, so simple and honest, made something inside her expand. There, under the soft lights of the park, Willow finally understood that sometimes the truest love isn't the one that arrives with fanfare and grand gestures, but the one that grows silently, nurtured by small moments of truth and devotion. And while Manhattan continued its frenetic pace around them, two souls who had taken 5 years to truly meet began to write a new chapter. This time, together. The press waited anxiously in the lobby of Richardson Investments as Nash conducted his first shareholder meeting since the press conference that exposed the whole truth about the love triangle that dominated Manhattan's headlines. In his top-floor office, he was adjusting his tie when Alexander Richardson, his father, walked in without knocking. "We need to discuss your decision to go public with your relationship with Willow," Alexander declared, his voice carrying the weight of decades running one of the country's largest investment firms. "There's nothing to discuss, Dad," Nash replied, maintaining his characteristic calm. "Willow and I didn't do anything wrong. It's not a question of right or wrong," Alexander sighed, taking a seat in a leather armchair. "It's a question of timing. Some conservative shareholders are questioning whether you didn't plan all this from the start." At that moment, Nash's phone vibrated with a message from Willow. "I've just received an interesting proposal from Random House. Can we talk over lunch?" An involuntary smile appeared on his lips, which did not go unnoticed by Alexander. "You know," the patriarch began, his voice softening, "you smiled just like I did when I first met your mother." The remark took Nash by surprise. His father rarely talked about personal matters, especially in the office. "Your mother told me about the conversation she had with Willow," Alexander continued. "About the old photos, about how you were always present in her life, even when you couldn't show your feelings." "Dad, let me finish," Alexander held up his hand. "I spent so much time worrying about the Richardson legacy that I almost lost sight of what really matters. Bradley chose his path, and you chose to wait for the right moment." On the other side of town, Willow was facing her own tense meeting at Morgan Publishing. Random House's proposal was tempting, a merger that could significantly expand the publisher's reach. But there was a condition. "They want you to temporarily step down as chairman," Claire explained, avoiding looking directly at Willow. "They think the recent drama could affect the company's image." Willow felt her blood run cold in her veins. Morgan Publishing was more than a company to her. It was the legacy of generations, the dream her grandfather had built from scratch. "How long?" she asked, her voice surprisingly firm. 6 months, Claire replied, "just until the waters calmed down." Lunch with Nash in the small French bistro in Soho turned into a discussion about their future, both personal and professional. "I'm not going to let you sacrifice your position in the company for our sake," Nash declared, his hand finding hers on the table. "It's not a sacrifice if it's temporary," Willow argued. "Besides, I have that children's literature project I've been putting off for years. Maybe this is the perfect time to devote myself to it." Nash watched her with that intensity that made her heart race. "I remember the day you told me about this project for the first time at the charity event. Your eyes shone in a special way. You really remember everything, don't you?" She smiled, feeling that familiar warmth in her chest that only his presence provoked. "Every moment," he confirmed, his thumb gently caressing her hand. "And I intend to keep collecting memories if you let me." The afternoon brought an unexpected surprise. Bradley appeared in Willow's office, this time alone and visibly uncomfortable. "Lauren is moving back to Chicago," he announced without preamble. "And I realized a few things over the last few days." Willow watched him, noticing how much smaller he seemed without his usual overconfidence. "What things, Bradley? That maybe I spent so much time trying to prove that I could have it all that I lost sight of what really mattered," he admitted. "Nash was always the perfect son, the responsible brother. I wanted to prove that I could achieve something he wanted." The realization struck Willow like a bolt of lightning. "Did you know about his feelings for me?" Bradley nodded slowly. "I think I always knew, but it was easier to pretend I didn't see it, that it was just another competition between brothers." The sun was beginning to set when Nash arrived at Willow's apartment that evening. Finding her on the balcony with a glass of wine and her gaze lost in the Manhattan skyline. "Bradley told me about your conversation," he said softly, joining her. "Sometimes I wonder what it would have been like if we'd been honest from the start," she reflected. "If that night at the charity event—" "We can't change the past," Nash interrupted her gently, "but we can choose how we write our future." And there, with the New York sky painted in shades of pink and gold, Willow realized that sometimes the longest detours take us exactly where we should be. The path may not have been the most direct, but every moment had prepared them for this present, and for the future they were beginning to build together. News of the merger between Morgan Publishing and Random House leaked to the press before the official announcement, creating a wave of speculation about Willow's temporary departure. The New York Business Journal published an article speculating whether the decision was related to her involvement with Nash Richardson. "Don't let them define your narrative," Nash said, entering Willow's office with the newspaper in hand. It was a Thursday morning, and the buzz in the corridors of Morgan Publishing seemed more intense than usual. "It's hard not to," Willow replied, organizing the last few things before her departure, "especially when part of the board agrees with them." Madison rushed in, holding her tablet. "You guys need to see this." Lauren gave an exclusive interview to the Daily Chronicle. On the screen, Lauren appeared perfectly produced, studied tears streaming down her face as she told her version of the facts. Bradley was manipulated, she claimed. Nash always wanted the company, the presidency, and Willow. He planned everything from the start. "That's ridiculous," Nash muttered, his usual calm giving way to restrained anger. "She's trying to destroy not only our reputation, but also our family's legacy." "Maybe," Willow pondered, an idea beginning to form in her mind. "It's time to tell our own story." That afternoon, Willow called an extraordinary meeting that included not only the Morgan Publishing Board, but also representatives from Random House and selected journalists. "For the next 6 months," she announced, her voice firm and clear, "I will be devoting myself to a special project, a series of children's books about family, love, and second chances. And yes, my relationship with Nash Richardson has inspired part of this journey." The room fell silent, surprised by her frankness. "Morgan Publishing has always been more than a book company," she continued. "We are storytellers, and sometimes the best stories are those that teach us about new beginnings." Nash, sitting in the front row, watched her with that look that still made her heart race. Next to him, Richard Morgan smiled proudly. After the meeting, while the press digested the unexpected announcement, Nash took Willow to a special place. The little cafe in Greenwich Village where he used to watch her work on weekends years ago. "You used to come here?" she asked, surprised to see the barista greet Nash by name. "Every Saturday," he admitted, ordering 2 cinnamon lattes, just as she always did. "You used to sit by the window, completely absorbed in your manuscripts. Sometimes I'd spend hours just watching you live." The confession, so honest and vulnerable, made something inside her expand. "How did you do it? All those years, keeping your feelings under wraps?" "It wasn't easy," Nash replied, his eyes meeting hers across the table. "Every time you smiled at Bradley, every family event, every moment when I had to pretend we were just friends. But your happiness was worth every second of pain." Willow's cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Bradley. "I saw your press conference. You're right about new beginnings. I'm going back to Boston to work in Richardson's regional office. You deserve to be happy." "He's trying," Willow showed Nash the message. In his own way, "Bradley's always been better at rebuilding than building," Nash commented, a small smile playing on his lips. Maybe it's his turn to learn about foundations. The rest of the afternoon was spent planning the coming months. Willow's children's book series was beginning to take shape, a story about a little fox who learns that family goes beyond blood ties. "You know what's funny?" she reflected as they walked back to her apartment in the Manhattan twilight. "If it hadn't been for all this storm, we might never have found our truth." Nash stopped, turning to face her. "Some truths are like stars, Willow. They've always been there, just waiting for the darkness to pass before they shine." The next day, as Willow packed up her belongings in the Morgan Publishing office, each item seemed to tell a different story. The picture frame with the photo from the charity event where she had met Nash, the pen he had given her on her first day as editor-in-chief, the good luck card she had found on his desk after her first big presentation. "Ready?" Nash asked from the doorway, watching her with that mixture of protectiveness and admiration that she now recognized so well. "To leave all this for 6 months?" "No," she admitted, putting the last item away in the box. "But ready to start our story?" "Absolutely." And as they left the building together, under the prying eyes of the staff and the occasional flash of paparazzi, Willow realized that sometimes you have to take one step back to take 2 steps forward. Their estrangement was not an end, but a beginning, the start of a story that, this time, would be written exactly as it should be. The Upper West Side woke up to the front page of the New York Times, showing a photo of Willow and Nash walking out of Morgan Publishing together. The headline, different from the usual sensationalism, had a more reflective tone. "Love and Business: How Two Manhattan Dynasties Are Rewriting Their Histories." Claire entered Willow's temporary apartment, carrying a stack of manuscripts and a determined look on her face. "The first drafts of your children's series have arrived from art, and you need to see this." The illustrations were astonishing. The little fox, with its expressive eyes, vaguely resembled Willow herself in her most vulnerable moments. The artist had perfectly captured the essence of the story about finding family in the most unexpected places. "They're perfect," Willow murmured, running her fingers over the colored pages. "It's exactly as I imagined. Random House is already talking about an initial print run of 100,000 copies," Claire informed her, taking a seat on the sofa. "Apparently, your personal story has created a considerable buzz in the publishing market." Willow's phone rang. It was Margaret Richardson. "Darling, I need you to come to the Hamptons house this afternoon. There's something you need to see." The curiosity in Margaret's voice was palpable, and 2 hours later, Willow was parking her Audi at the Richardson estate. The house, a seaside mansion that had witnessed decades of family history, looked different in the autumn light. In the attic, Margaret directed her as soon as she entered. Alexander was organizing some old documents and found something interesting. The Richardson attic was a treasure trove of family memories. Old photographs, yellow documents, and relics from generations past filled the space. Alexander was crouching over an old box when they arrived. "Ah, Willow," he smiled, something rare in the always serious patriarch. "Look at this." It was a set of letters, all handwritten in the elegant handwriting she would recognize anywhere. Nash's handwriting. They dated back 5 years, addressed to Alexander, but never sent. "Dad," the first one began, "I met someone today at the Morgan Publishing charity party. Her name is Willow, and she has the most genuine smile I've ever seen. But Bradley noticed her too, and you know how he is when he decides he wants something." Willow felt her hands shaking as she read. Each letter told the story of the last 5 years through Nash's eyes, his silent pain, his determination to protect her happiness, even if it meant sacrificing his own. "Why didn't you ever send them?" Margaret asked her husband softly. "Because Nash asked me to keep them," Alexander replied. "He said that one day, when the time was right, they would tell a story that needed to be told." Willow's cell phone vibrated with a message from Nash. "Dinner tonight? I have a surprise for you." "Go on." Margaret smiled, noticing the sparkle in her eyes. "And Willow, take the cards with you." The restaurant Nash had chosen was discreet, tucked away on a quiet street in the West Village. When Willow arrived, he was already waiting for her at the corner table, 2 glasses of champagne in front of him. "I found your letters today," she said without preamble, placing the package on the table. "In your parents' attic." Nash didn't seem surprised. "I figured my father would find them eventually. It was my way of dealing with everything. Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Even after Bradley, because you needed time," he replied simply. "To heal, to understand, to find out for yourself what you really wanted." The waiter brought the starter, tuna tartar, his favorite. Nash always remembered the little details. "You know what else I found today?" he continued, reaching for something in his pocket. "This." It was an old key, attached to a key ring with a modern publishing symbol. The key to the publisher's first office, Willow recognized immediately. "How did you—" "Your father gave it to me," Nash explained. "He said it belonged to the founder of Morgan Publishing, your grandfather. And now, well, I thought you could use it for something new." "Something new?" "I bought a space in Brooklyn," he revealed. "A perfect location for a creative studio where you can work on your children's books, away from the chaos of Manhattan, but close enough to keep in touch with the publisher." Willow felt tears forming in her eyes. It was exactly what she needed, a space to start again, to create, to be herself again. "Nash," she began, her voice laced with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," he smiled, reaching for a hand on the table. "Just promise you'll let me be part of this new story." The rest of the evening passed like a dream. Easy conversation, genuine laughter, and that growing feeling that sometimes fate has its own timing for bringing together two people who were always destined to meet. The creative studio in Brooklyn that Nash had bought for Willow quickly became their refuge over the next 2 months. The space, an old renovated warehouse with huge industrial windows and reclaimed wood floors, breathed inspiration from every corner. That winter morning, while working on the final illustrations for her children's book, Willow received an unexpected call from Bradley. "I found some of your things here in the Boston office," he said, his voice carrying an unusual hesitation. "A photo album from college. There are some pictures of you with Nash, from the time you visited the campus before we officially met." Willow's heart stopped for a moment. She had completely forgotten about that visit to MIT, where Nash was studying for his MBA. It had been a year before the charity event where it all began, or rather, where it all began again. "Did you already know?" she asked softly. "About that meeting?" "Nash never mentioned it," Bradley replied after a pause. "But looking at these photos now, the way he looked at you even back then, I think I always knew. I just chose to ignore it." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Claire, carrying the last proofs of the book. "Random House loves the direction the story is taking," she announced, spreading the pages out on the word table. "Especially the part where the little fox discovers that his real family was there all along." Willow smiled, recognizing the parallels with her own life. The children's book series had become something much bigger than a project to fill her temporary gap. It was a way of processing her own journey of self-discovery. Madison called. Claire continued, taking a seat on the studio's vintage sofa. "The press are finally changing their tune. That interview you and Nash gave to the New Yorker about turning difficult experiences into art really touched people." The phone vibrated with a message from Nash. "Dinner at the Penthouse tonight? I have news about the foundation." The Richardson Morton Foundation for Early Childhood Education had been Nash's idea, a way of channeling all the media attention into something positive. The project, which provided books and educational resources for public schools, was growing faster than expected. "He really thinks of everything, doesn't he?" Claire commented, noticing the smile on Willow's face. "It's more than that," Willow replied, looking out of the studio window at the Brooklyn Bridge in the distance. "Nash has this ability to turn challenges into opportunities to do something meaningful." When she arrived at Nash's penthouse that evening, she found not only him, but also his parents and Richard Morgan. The table was set for a formal dinner, and there was an atmosphere of expectation in the air. "Before we begin," Alexander Richardson said, raising his glass, "there's something Margaret and I would like to share." Margaret smiled, reaching for an old folder. "We found this in the family archives. It's the first partnership agreement between Richardson Investments and Morgan Publishing, signed by our parents 50 years ago. And today," Richard Morgan continued, "we would like to propose a new partnership. Random House has approved the creation of an independent children's division, run by the Richardson Morgan Foundation. Willow looked at Nash, who was smiling in that way that made her heart melt. Did you know about this? Only the foundation part, he admitted. The rest was their idea. Morgan Publishing has always been more than a publishing house, Richard explained, his voice charged with emotion. It's a legacy of telling stories that matter. And now, with the foundation, we can ensure that those stories reach children who really need them. And who better to lead this project, Margaret added, than someone who has turned their own story of loss into a message of hope? Willow felt tears forming in her eyes as Nash held her hand under the table. Somehow, all the events of the last few months, the cancelled wedding, the scandal, the temporary estrangement, had aligned to create something much bigger than themselves. There's one more thing, Nash said softly, standing up. The silence that followed made Willow's heart race. It was the moment that would define not only their future, but the future of two families who, through meetings, disagreements, and reconciliations, had become one. The snow was beginning to fall softly over Manhattan when Nash knelt in front of Willow that night in the penthouse, under the emotional gazes of their families. The ring he held was not new. It had belonged to his grandmother, the same woman who, decades ago, had helped establish the first partnership between the Richardson and Morgan families. Willow Morgan, Nash began, his voice firm but charged with emotion. I've spent 5 years treasuring this moment in my heart. 5 years of watching you shine from afar, grow into the extraordinary woman you are today. I'm not asking you to be mine. You've always been your own person, and that's what I admire most about you. I'm asking for the chance to walk alongside you, to build something new, something of our own. Margaret Richardson discreetly wiped away a tear as Richard Morgan smiled, his arm around the shoulders of Claire, who had arrived minutes before the proposal, carrying the latest proofs of Willow's children's book. Yes, Willow replied, her voice breaking but her eyes shining with certainty. 1,000 times yes. The moment was interrupted by the sound of the elevator. Bradley had arrived from Boston, still wearing his meeting suit, carrying an old box. Sorry I'm late, he said, pausing as he saw the scene before him. A genuine smile, perhaps the first in months, appeared on his face. I think I'm just in time. The box he was carrying contained more than just the MIT photo album. There were letters, notes, and small mementos documenting Nash and Willow's untold story over the years. I found this in the old office, Bradley explained, handing the box to his brother. I think it's time all the stories were told. While the families celebrated the engagement, Willow leafed through the contents of the box with Nash. Each item revealed a moment, a possibility that fate had saved for just the right moment. Look at this, she murmured, holding up a napkin with a few words scribbled on it. It was from the cafe in Greenwich Village, dated 3 years ago. Nash had written, she smiled today, that smile that lights up the whole room. Someday I'll have the courage to say that every smile of hers is like a sunrise for me. The snow outside intensified, turning Manhattan into a winter postcard. In the Warren apartment, plans were beginning to take shape. The Richardson Morgan Foundation would be officially launched in the spring, along with the first book in Willow's children's series. I've thought of a name for the first book, Willow commented, nestled in Nash's arms as the families chatted animatedly. I'm going to call it The Fox Who Waited. Nash smiled, recognizing the reference. And how long did she wait? As long as it took, Willow replied, playing with the ring on her finger, an antique sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. Exactly as long as it took to find her true home. Madison arrived later, bringing champagne and tight hugs. I knew it, she exclaimed, hugging Willow. Ever since that first day at the publishing house, when I saw how Nash looked at you during your presentation, the evening progressed with stories being shared, memories being relived in a new light. Alexander Richardson raised his glass, drawing everyone's attention. 50 years ago, he began, our parents signed a contract that united two companies. Today, we celebrate a much more meaningful union, one that needs no contracts or signatures, only love, respect, and truth. Bradley approached Willow as the celebration began to wind down. That day when I sent that stupid message, it was the biggest mistake of my life. But maybe it was necessary to fix something that should never have happened in the first place. Sometimes we need to get lost to find a right path, Willow replied softly. The next morning, as Manhattan awoke under a white blanket of snow, Willow found Nash in his Brooklyn studio. He was sitting on his favorite sofa, leafing through the final proofs of the book. "The little fox looks like you," he commented, pointing to a particularly expressive illustration. "And the wolf that quietly protects it looks a lot like you," she replied, taking a seat next to him. The winter sun streamed in through the large industrial windows, creating golden patterns on the wooden floor. On the work table, the last details of the book awaited attention. But at that moment, all that mattered was the present and the future that was unfolding before them. "Do you know what else I found in Bradley's box?" Nash asked, reaching for something in his pocket. It was a folded piece of paper, yellowed by time. "The ticket for that lecture at MIT, where we met for the first time. I've kept it all these years." Willow took the ticket carefully, as if it were a precious relic. "Why didn't you ever mention that day?" "Because that wasn't our moment," he replied simply. "But every moment since then has brought us here. And now, finally, it's our turn to write our own story." And so, between children's books and corporate mergers, between Manhattan snow and rediscovered memories, two people who were always destined to meet finally found their own happily ever after. Not at the end of a fairy tale, but at the beginning of a real story, built on a foundation of truth, patience, and unconditional love.